Hi, this is Kowski, and in this video we are going to go into part two of our review. In the last video we left off with Congress. Now let's get into the President. You'll see that there are various formal powers in Article 2, and when we talk about formal powers, we're talking about those specifically listed in the Constitution. So everything with respect to enforcing the laws, being the Commander-in-Chief, granting pardons, reporting on the State of the Union, those are your formal powers. However, there are a lot of informal powers that are, somewhat built around Article 2 of the Constitution, but they've expanded quite significantly since FDR. So some of these morale builder, crisis manager, think, for example, with the coronavirus and President Trump, or think about George W. Bush with respect to 9/11. You have issues with, world leader, right? They represent the United States to the world, and sometimes the world actually looks to our country's president for guidance. So various powers there. Now, it's important to note that some of the major powers built into the presidency, executive orders. These have significantly expanded the power of the presidency with just the signing of a pen. Basically having the weight of law. Although they are not binding for future presidents, but the president can create a national park, can direct the bureaucracy to enforce a rule a certain way. So there's a lot of power there. The president can also create agreements with other nations. Again, not binding for future presidents, but it's sort of, you've seen the power of the presidency really grow, and Congress sometimes struggles to check with that. Also, I would argue that the war powers of the presidency are humongous, right? We have not sent troops in officially by Congress declaring war since World War II, but Korean War, the Vietnam War, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc., those fall under the president being the commander-in-chief. So very important here. So these are some of the major ones that I do want to point out for you. Now, it's important to note that the president, isn't just himself. When you look at the executive branch, it is composed of more than just one person. It's composed of thousands. You could argue hundreds of thousands, actually. When you look at the cabinet, so these are the order in which they have been created and their various functions. They serve as advisors to the president. And then there's also part of the executive office where the president has a National Security Council, has a Council of Economic Advisors, and also has a Office of Management and Budget. Even though Congress has the power of the purse, Congress looks to the president to draft the budget. Of course, Congress will then hammer out what that budget will actually look like. Now, the amendment specific to the presidency, 20th Amendment, which basically is going to say the president is going to get inaugurated in January instead of March. There's a great video where I list all the amendments and great ways to memorize them. Those are on my channel if you want to consult them. 22nd Amendment limits the president to 2 terms. It officially enshrines it in the Constitution. And then the 25th Amendment basically specifying the pecking order. Should anything happen to the president, it would then be the Vice President, Speaker of the House, President pro tempore, and then the order of the cabinets in which they were created. One of the big Federalist papers related to the presidency is, of course, Federalist number 70, where Hamilton is going to argue for a single and strong executive leader. Some of the reasons for this is to add accountability, even adding energy and excitement, if you will, to the role that the president is going to play, along with some other powers that you see here. But one underestimated thing about the presidency is the power of the bully pulpit. And if you look at Teddy Roosevelt in particular, you're really using the power of, the public for policy. You're urging, the citizens to contact their congresswoman or congressman to advocate for something. Really, right? The president represents the government, represents the country. So when the president is speaking, has the full, attention of citizens, that's a lot of power. Also, during the State of the Union, the agenda-setting effect, and you can even look today how technology has impacted the bully pulpit. Twitter in chief, right? A lot of presidents in the past 2 or 3 years or 2 or 3 terms have utilized Twitter in such a way. Now, what are the checks on the executive? Well, Congress, of course, has confirmation power, can check any appointment, override vetoes, power of the purse, huge one right there, and then, of course, impeachment. The judicial branch, its power is always going to be the judicial review, right? The power to declare a law unconstitutional. And speaking of the judiciary, when we look at Federalist Paper 78, when the Constitution is looking to be ratified, Federalist 78 is very important because it's saying that it is the least injurious to people's rights. And I think that's very important to note, right? It doesn't have the power of the purse. It does not have the power of the sword, meaning it can't, tax people and it can't injure people, right? You're not going to see Ruth Bader Ginsburg. If someone's not following her, ruling, she's not going to come out with a sword and try to enforce it, right? That's dependent on the executive branch. But the power that's really going to be important here is the power of judicial review that's going to be established under Marbury v. Madison. That's going to be huge. One thing that the judicial branch likes to do is adhere to precedent. This is, of course, known as stare decisis, where they're really not going to try to overrule former Supreme Courts. I mean, occasionally it does happen, like Brown v. Board of Education, but most of the time they like to defer to past examples. But again, the big problem here is the lack of implementation. They can't stray too far away from popular opinion. If they do, people won't follow it. And then, of course, you have judicial activism, where some are accused of being more legislative, right? The branch is supposed to interpret the law, whereas people who think it should be, interpreted based on how the original founding fathers wanted it, and that's the only way that they should view the Constitution, that's more associated with what's called judicial restraint. So be aware of those two philosophies there. Checks on the Supreme Court. Well, certainly Congress can modify an impact of a SCOTUS decision based on passing legislation. They can also create amendments, right? Also, judicial appointments by the president being confirmed by the Senate is a check on the Supreme Court. And then presidents and states can simply just ignore decisions. That is technically a check. And then in some cases, Congress can even alter the jurisdiction of cases as to what the Supreme Court can actually hear. All right, now while this is not technically another branch, it falls under the executive branch, but some people like to refer to it as the fourth branch. But the bureaucracy, they are the action figures of government. And when we look at the bureaucracy, there are four different aspects. You have the cabinets, right? The 15 departments under the president, the advisors, right? And then you have the independent regulatory agencies. They regulate some sector of the economy, right? EPA, Environment, Securities and Exchange Commission, being Wall Street. Then you have government corporations that are making money, but they're also charging for a service. Great example being Amtrak, right? That's government owned. And then you have the independent executive agencies where they're not a cabinet, they're not advising the president, they're not regulating a sector of the economy, and they're not making money. So think NASA, right? Technically, that's where they would fall. But the role of the bureaucracy, they are implementing government policy so that Congress is creating, but you need people to enforce it. If you go to the DMV, those are state bureaucrats, right? Also, the bureaucracy, they can write fines, they can enforce regulations. Remember, regulations are rules. They are part of this issue network and iron triangle. Definitely look at that. And then when you work in a bureaucracy, remember civil service, that you're getting promoted based on what you know and not who you know. That's part of the merit selection process. But some of the checks on the bureaucracy, well, a lot of their discretionary authority is going to be dependent upon how specific the legislation is. Sometimes Congress doesn't like to give too much specifics in the laws. They feel that the bureaucracy is more of they're the more technical people. They know how to enforce it. That's their bread and butter. So let's give them authority to do what they need to do. But certainly Congress can rein them in. As you see here, power of the purse, abolishment power. Also, the executive branch can utilize executive orders as well as appointments for those who are going to head each agency. So let's get into Unit 3, liberties and rights. Keep in mind, when we talk about civil liberties, we're talking about individual rights. When we're talking about civil rights, we're talking about group rights that have been, historically denied to people, for example, African Americans. And these are all going to basically come from the Bill of Rights, with the exception, I would say, too, of the 14th Amendment. But each part of the Bill of Rights is going to have to be selectively incorporated because the Bill of Rights originally was seen to pertain just to the national government and not to the state government. So each part of the Bill of Rights has more or less been selectively incorporated. Technically not every single right, if you want to be specific, but the majority actually have. So the Freedom of Religion Establishment Clause, right, out of the First Amendment. This is part of Jefferson's wall of separation between church and state, meant to prevent a national religion. Big case here, Engel v. Vitale, and again, I have a whole video just on these Supreme Court decisions, but that, voluntary recitations of prayers and Bible passages are unconstitutional. And then when you look at the other aspect of freedom of religion, the Free Exercise Clause, it prohibits the government from interfering with the practice of religion. So when you look at Wisconsin v. Yoder in 1972, Amish parents do not have to formally educate their children beyond the 8th grade, despite the fact that that is a law in many, actually really all states. So it is part of their religious community that they stop at 8th grade, and the Supreme Court ruled that the government should not be interfering with that. Here's an interesting case in dealing with the Establishment Clause. This was in Maryland, and this was actually ruled to be constitutional, not a violation of separation of church and state under the Establishment Clause. This is seen as actually more of history, believe it or not. So, it really depends on the makeup of the Supreme Court at that point. Now, Tinker v. Des Moines, under the freedom of expression, speech, and press, is going to, of course, create the Tinker test. The question is, does it cause a disruption if you're wearing an armband or something controversial to the educational environment? In this case, no, it did not. Wearing the peace symbol is going to be seen as constitutional. In Schenck v. U.S., when somebody was distributing leaflets urging men to resist the draft, that's going to actually be considered constitutional. It's going to establish what's called the clear and present danger test. So depending on the action, that just because you have a freedom of speech or freedom of expression doesn't mean that particular amendment is absolute. And then you have the New York Times versus U.S. That's dealing with the Pentagon Papers. The government cannot prevent something true from being published, even if it is obtained illegally and conveys government secrets and could endanger government national security. That is a big win for newspapers, and so that's going to expand the First Amendment. Then when we look at criminal cases, you're probably familiar with Miranda v. Arizona. Under your Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights, police must inform suspects of their rights to remain silent and their right to an attorney or counsel. And then, of course, with Gideon v. Wainwright, you have a right to a lawyer in criminal cases. However, that does not pertain to civil cases. And then Mapp v. Ohio, under the Fourth Amendment, that any evidence illegally seized by the police, for example, if they didn't have a warrant and they barged into your house, they cannot use that against you in the court of law as per what's called the exclusionary rule. And it's important to note that the 14th Amendment is probably the hallmark amendment here. It includes what's called the Due Process Clause, where states may not deny a person life, liberty, or property without having some due process of law. That you have to have, for example, a trial, right? That process. And then the Equal Protection Clause, stating that states may not deny a person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of laws. This is where we're dealing with civil rights cases, whereas the due process is typically dealing with civil liberty cases. In McDonald v. Chicago, even though this is a Second Amendment case that strikes down the handgun the ban of the 14th the 14th Amendment is going to consider this a fundamental right. So while this is a Second Amendment case, it also is going to utilize the 14th Amendment with respect to selective incorporation. And then with Roe v. Wade, this is more of a complicated case, but ultimately they're going to utilize the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, that liberty is considered a fundamental right to privacy, and that the Due Process Clause uses person, but this does not actually include the unborn, according to the SCOTUS decision. It also takes part of the Ninth Amendment that you have, even rights that are not specified do not necessarily mean that they are denied to the people, and the Supreme Court at this point said that that also included to a woman's decision. Then when we get into civil rights, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is going to make racism in terms of discrimination illegal in public places such as hotels and restaurants. Even the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is going to prevent individuals from, or preventing the government from denying individuals the right to vote, such as, putting literacy tests there. That's going to be made illegal. And then on top of that, we have the 24th Amendment, which is going to outlaw poll taxes. And one of the fundamental documents here is the letter from a Birmingham jail, which is going to be from Martin Luther King, who's going to lay out the framework for civil disobedience, in which he's also going to advocate that people have a moral obligation to break up unjust laws. Perhaps the biggest case here is Brown v. Board of Education, which is going to overturn Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal, and it's going to utilize, once again, the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Be familiar with the NAACP and Thurgood Marshall, who are going to argue under the Warren Court, which is going to see the expansion of civil rights and liberties. Other 14th Amendment rights here, women. Think about Title IX. That's important for expanding women's access in terms of sports, particularly at the college level. Also now, the National Organization of Women, very important in the 1970s as well. And then, of course, the Equal Rights Amendment. This one's a little bit tricky because it's a little bit more modern, as they technically now have enough states to ratify this, but it's still in a period of flux. But that's a big, big part of expanding women's rights. And then lastly, with LGBTQ, same-sex marriage, of course, becoming constitutional. Don't Ask, Don't Tell being repealed by Obama. And then even Lawrence v. Texas saying that sodomy cannot be made illegal is a big, big win for the LGBT community. So this was meant to be a quick overview of units 1 through 3. I encourage you to look at my other videos for a more thorough review. Thank you.